Hello everyone, and welcome to the internally screening review of The Beyond from 1981. I'm Rupert.
I'm Adam.
And yeah, today we're going to be having a look at Beyond, which is a cult classic Italian-produced film by Lucio Fulci, or Fulci. I don't know, I don't speak Italian, you'll be shocked to hear. And it's a classic, low-budget 80s horror film about a woman who inherits a haunted hotel and things, immediately go bad. And I guess it's somewhat notable, at least, for being an Italian production by an Italian director. Obviously, Italian horror in the 70s and 80s was flying high with the giallo genre, making a lot of money, if not making a lot of mainstream impact. And this certainly has its sort of giallo-ish elements, but is notable for being in English and not just a dubbed over English, but with actual American actors, and also being more, I guess, paranormal focused than being a straight up slasher, with a sort of slightly more art housey body horror and atmospheric approach to the horror, as opposed to the cheap thrills you'd normally get from something where you see the cover of this film you would expect. Adam, what did you think of The Beyond?
I found it very interesting, actually. I can't really tell exactly how good the film is. It's a difficult one, or at least on some level of objectivity, but I was really quite taken with its style. It was very sort of visually interesting, and I liked the soundtrack. It kind of sort of veers between this sort of spooky classical and then the really sort of garish but quite sort of fun and upbeat kind of like prog rock, which kind of gave me a little bit of a
Suspiria.
That's
the
it.
Goblin soundtrack.
Yeah, the Goblin soundtrack for Suspiria. Just that there's that parallel, obviously, to Italian films seeming to share that quality. The first thing that really struck me immediately was the quite visceral gore you get in this film. Immediately in the film, we have this kind of, it begins off with this flashback, and a man is brutally crucified in a basement, and then acid is poured on his face, and his skull
and he
starts
gets pulled
melting
apart by hooks and stuff, right?
Yeah, they whip him with chains, and he has these huge lacerations. The blood looks really thin and watery, but
ribena.
Yeah, it looks
ribena blood.
It does look
from
like
the
ribena.
80s. It was a serious problem back then.
Yeah, they learned better nutrition since then, so people's blood wasn't so horribly thin.
The invention of corn syrup really kind of rejuvenated the horror genre, I think.
But yeah, the gore really stays throughout as a really palpable, visceral thing. A lot of eye gore. There's a man gets his eyes gouged out. A woman gets a nail through the back of her head that pops out her eye. Really not just, shocking, but very well executed as well. All it's quite sort of seamless work between puppetry, mannequins and whatever, and then the real actors. There's a weird bit where a man's being bitten and attacked by spiders. They do clever cuts to where the spiders are sort of eating bits of his face. And it's quite hard to discern where the actor is being used and where he's not, because they're getting some stuff really deep in his mouth and things like that, biting its tongue. It was very it's horrible, but very impressively done.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that this film is interesting. I don't know if I'm as fond of it as you are. I guess the interesting things about it for me primarily are the sort of the visual style and the atmosphere, and a lot of these Italian horror films are sort of quite preoccupied with religious themes and Catholicism in particular. And there was some interesting stuff there, sort of, about heaven and hell and purgatory and this otherworldly plane that's kind of leaking out into reality. And I think there's some interesting stuff there, but to be honest, my experience of these kind of old school Italian horror films is that I generally don't really like them, even the most acclaimed ones. I know we just spoke about Suspiria. I'm not a particularly big fan of the original Suspiria either. But Dario Argento does have all of these kind of films do have a really distinct style to them that makes them unique, and I do think this film, Suspiria, is quite striking in a different way, but this certainly has some interesting imagery, particularly when the woman just appears in front of the road, in the middle of the road when she's driving. Is it the blind woman who just appears? There's quite a nice shot of that, and the final shot of the film as well is also quite creepy. And like you say, the gore stuff is kind of grisly and fun in its own way. But it does feel like it's kind of shooting for something a bit deeper, and because with these kind of, I guess, Italian translations, and the limitations that come with these horror films, the acting's pretty bad. There's like not really much pacing in terms of the story, and I don't think the story really delivers. And if this film was going to do something that was not particularly narrative heavy and more focused on the visuals and the atmosphere, I think that would be fine, and that could actually be amazing and like work perfectly as a film. But I don't think this film really pulls it off, because the film does spend quite a decent amount of time on its characters and on the story. It's just that the story is not very interesting, the acting's not very good, and there's just a kind of awkward direction in those moments. But yeah, when it gets to the big scare moments and the oh wow that's gross moments, of this film, it is really good, and I can see why it has the following that it does. But yeah, I just wasn't really that taken with it overall.
Yeah, acting wise, I guess I haven't really paid it much mind, given that there's so much style kind of overlaying on top of it that it kind of disguises or perhaps distracts you from it. But yeah, not that I hated the acting, but that it definitely felt awkward at points, like the certain things. And maybe there's stuff around an Italian director sort of trying to convey what he wants to an American actor, doesn't necessarily help these things. Yeah, I guess it was quite stereotypical, hokey horror acting is like very middling, not offensive, but nothing particularly striking that could elevate the material. And story-wise,
that can be part of the charm, but it just, like, because the film does have like mechanics that it needs to explain, it kind of fails on that front.
Yeah,
it's the same thing with Suspiria as well. Actually, there's like a bunch of stuff that like really needs like a good amount of exposition to get across, and because the acting is quite bad, and there's ADR obviously.
Right.
Though, again, if we're going down the Suspiria comparison line, this film's ADR is actually pretty masterful in comparison.
Okay. I mean, I have not yet seen the original Suspiria. I'm only familiar with its Goblin soundtrack, but with the storyline, I find myself like coming back to it. I watched it a second time. I realised it kind of trails off in a way. I feel like it sets up this sort of really grand kind of horrifying premise of the gates of hell being opened in the basement of this hotel. Mm-hmm. And yet, in telling its story in quite like a psychedelic and trippy way, focusing on like the imagery that of this painting in particular that keeps reoccurring, rather than it having some like a particularly concrete final act that sort of sums up or like delivers on the concepts of religion and I don't know, provides something more satisfyingly final to the whole piece. You instead get like a weird, it sort of pivots into being a zombie movie that was far less visually interesting and a little bit, I guess, cliched and simplistic in comparison to the brilliant visuals of the previous two acts. Yeah, it did feel a little, not that I hated it, I didn't mind it, but it didn't feel anywhere near as like grand or as interesting as what had come before it. And then you get the final scene where they're like
it just becomes Dawn of the Dead, where the guy's got a shotgun and he's like pistol, and he's
like he's just running around shooting people. And then you get the final scene where they seem to be trapped in the painting, and the painting has this kind of metaphysical quality to it. Perhaps it's like a gateway in of itself, because that was being painted by the guy in the flashback that either opened the gate or was trying to stop the gate from being opened. It's hard to tell. Story-wise, it does seem to kind of fall apart a bit. But in some ways, I can see that being part of the charm as well, because you could easily argue, in contrary to that's the point of it, is that it's like more nebulous, that the idea of hell isn't just like this concrete like man versus a bunch of demons type thing, that it's actually like kind of beyond our understanding, and it's it has this whole psychological and psychedelic angle to it.
Yeah, and I think there's something interesting to say about that. I mean, maybe the film is, you could look at the painting and see it as like the film commenting on films, maybe it's being meta in that way. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe there is some kind of interesting reading. I just didn't get anything that really hooked me. The only things that really stick with me with this film are particular like moments in the film, like you said, the sort of tarantula spider scene, was quite memorable. The opening scene where the guy's getting killed was quite memorable, and I've got the bit where the woman has this woman has a weird preoccupation with acid, where like the acid's being like poured on her face in the hospital, and her face just like melts.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
It felt almost kind of like sort of Final Destination-y there.
Yeah,
I guess maybe
for sure.
Like there's this kind of like greater force working beyond you. Although I guess The Omen, I think, predates this film, so maybe that is probably the biggest influence. But
right.
Yeah, there's like individual moments, and almost all of those moments for me are sort of the spectacle moments.
Yeah.
Which you can see from watching this film. That's that's where the budget went. And yeah, I didn't find the woman who inherits the hotel to be particularly interesting. I thought the blind woman, she could have been interesting, but she's kind of just sort of like a generic sort of oracle character.
Right.
Whose one defining trait is that she's creepy and blind. And the main dude, who sort of seems like he might be some kind of like love interest, but they don't really do anything with that either. At the end of the film, his function is just to be a guy with a gun, and then you have this sort of final twist, and then the film's over. And it just kind of washed over me, to be honest.
Yeah,
it's not a bad film, and I can see why it has a cult following, and there are like a lot of things to appreciate about it. I just wonder if I think it maybe gets a little bit more credit than it maybe deserves, just because it's got this kind of art house glaze to it, where it's got this kind of more alternative European styled, slightly less gimmicky perhaps in how it's viewed compared to a lot of other giallo films, but I think it probably is just as gimmicky as those other giallo films, to be honest.
I mean, I can't comment on that, but I don't know if I'd go with it being gimmicky in that sense. I think it relies a lot on its stylish kills, like we said, but I do think there is something genuinely quite interesting and distinct about the way it's styled. I guess the gimmicky criticism would come from its kind of lack of a substantial backbone as a story. It suggests themes but doesn't really seem to capitalize on anything in a meaningful way. It's like, gates of hell are opening, and then the characters just kind of meander around in and around, going from kill to kill to kill. It is quite vague in that sense. So I understand the criticism of it being gimmicky in so much as there's just not enough substantial beyond its aesthetic. But I think its aesthetic is so distinct that it kind of earns its reputation as a very distinct and memorable piece of art. And I guess maybe it works better in that way. It works better as a purely visual piece than it does something with more, raw substance and meaning.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's just because this film is quite cheap. So the reason a lot of these films were made is because they were cheap to make, and you could then make quite a lot of money out of them, right?
Right.
Back in the 80s, because there was a real sort of niche market for horror films that would pretty much just, watch anything and everything. So,
right.
This was sort of like a low investment with a potentially high outcome. And there are a lot of great films made that way. I just think that maybe if it was going to go for that kind of ambiguous style where the story is not really too relevant and it's more about the visuals and the atmosphere and the spectacle moments, which I enjoyed across the board, then I guess maybe I might have preferred this film if it just sort of committed to that and didn't sort of do like a halfway house job. But maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'd be interested to rewatch it regardless. What would you rate The Beyond?
I'd give it a solid 6 out of 10. I think, as I've said, the aesthetic qualities, the goriness, the psychedelic nature of it really give it something very distinctive and memorable visually, but it lacks severely when you kind of come down to the raw storytelling aspects of it. But there is just a really sinister atmosphere throughout that feels quite, I don't know, it's haunting. But as you say, our main characters don't really seem to have an awful lot to do with the core of it. Like it does seem that like they orbit the most interesting, sinister aspects of it, and they're more there just to give the audience an excuse to experience those more outrageous visual moments.
Well, I think that's probably on purpose. I think it is more of like the sort of more cosmic horror. It's more about this kind of unexplainable thing that's happening beyond the character's control. I think you could do something interesting with that, but as I said, I don't really think the film delivers on that. Or
it doesn't really build the characters around it either, though. Those characters don't seem to learn a huge amount from their experience other than to be frightened and concerned.
Yeah, exactly. So for that reason, I'm going straight down the middle, 5 out of 10. It was interesting, and I think has real moments of, like I said, spectacle and just really entertaining horror film goofiness that feels much more almost 70s than 80s, to be honest. This feels like, I guess I called it an 80s horror film, which it technically is, but this really feels like a 70s horror film. It has that sort of grittiness and that kind of wonky, jarring soundtrack. So yeah, I could still recommend this and revisit it, but for now I'm going with a 5 out of 10. So before we leave, I will also mention, do not watch this film on Amazon Prime, whatever the fuck you do, because the audio is completely fucked. And I can't believe that Amazon, with all their money and power, have somehow allowed that to happen.
Wait, so what's wrong with the audio on it?
It's like completely out of sync, and the film also just looks like shit. It's like streaming in 480 for some reason. It just looks absolutely god awful. So if you watch this review and you're interested in this, don't watch it on Amazon. Find some other means, buy the DVD or something, because my god, you don't want to watch it in that state. But anyways, this has been our review of The Beyond. We hope you've enjoyed this review. We've got more Hooptober stuff coming out soon. We will be wrapping it up shortly. That is a promise. One day. Subscribe to the channel. If you like the video, hit the like button. If you dislike the video, hit the dislike button. And we'll catch you in the next Hooptober review. Peace.